Her arrival at court carried a stench no one dared describe aloud, a smell that shattered a royal marriage and sealed the tragic fate of Henry VIII's fourth wife. How could a single impression destroy a queen's future and ignite a scandal powerful enough to reshape a kingdom? Stay and uncover the disturbing truth history tried to soften. The unwelcome bride Anne of Cleves arrived in England carrying a future already poisoned by whispers. Not through any fault of her own, but because King Henry VIII approached marriage like a battlefield, every alliance a weapon, every bride a strategy. By the time her ship reached the gray shores of Dover, the fate awaiting her had less to do with diplomacy and more with the king's increasingly fragile ego. England needed stability. Henry needed admiration. Anne offered neither, though no one warned her of that truth. She entered his kingdom unaware that a single moment would determine whether she would be cherished, tolerated, or destroyed. The Tudor court watched her arrival with obsessive interest. Envoys wrote anxiously, ambassadors schemed, and spies reported every detail. Anne's portrait, painted by the careful hand of Hans Holbein, had convinced Henry that she was the perfect match. That portrait, with its measured elegance and strategic artistry, had given her a promise she never made. The king believed he had found not only a wife, but a symbol, a woman who could soothe his wounded pride and bind his alliance with the German princes. But portraits do not breathe, and paint cannot convey the truth of a person's presence. Henry would soon learn that what he imagined and what stood before him were not the same. Anne stepped into this world with earnest caution. She spoke little English, understood few of the customs, and carried herself with the reserved dignity of her German upbringing. But the English court was not gentle with newcomers. Every movement she made was assessed, every word weighed. She could not know that she was walking directly into the most ruthless arena of her life, where perception mattered more than reality, and where a single misstep could alter the course of a kingdom. Her attendants sensed the tension, even before she did. The English officials who greeted her smiled politely, but their eyes were sharp, searching for flaws, collecting material for the king's judgment. What Anne could not see was the storm gathering around her. Henry had grown increasingly insecure about his power and his fading vitality. His leg ulcer tormented him. His body had become a prison of pain, and his temper was a weapon with no safety. He wanted a wife who made him feel young again, powerful again, desirable again. Anne did not know she was expected to heal wounds she could not see. She had been raised to obey, to maintain composure, to serve her duty, but no training prepared her for the volatile court of Henry VIII. As she traveled toward London, nobles rode ahead of her, sending constant reports to the king. Their letters praised her politeness, her modesty, her noble stature. But beneath the praise lurked uncertainty. They described her clothing as unusually heavy and conservative. They noted her reluctance to smile. They whispered that she seemed cool, unanimated, difficult to read. These were minor observations. But in a court hungry for drama, minor observations quickly became seeds of disaster. Yet the true catastrophe began before Anne even reached London. Henry, restless and eager to impress, insisted on meeting her in disguise, a favorite romantic gesture of his, though one that had grown more absurd with age. Disguised as a humble servant, he burst into her chambers, expecting her to react with awe, joy, or some sign that she recognized his grandeur even through the deception. Instead, Anne greeted him politely, unaware she was speaking to the king. To Henry, this was humiliation. To Anne, it was simply a stranger entering unannounced. That moment cracked the foundation of their marriage before it had even begun. From that point on, Henry saw everything through a lens of disappointment. Anne's accent, her clothing, her posture, even the way she moved her hands, all became irritations. The king wanted magic. He found formality. He wanted instant desire. He found respectful distance. And when Henry's wounded pride collided with the court's hunger for gossip, the story began to twist. Whispers entered the air, subtle at first, then sharper. She repels him. She confuses him. Something about her is off. The tragedy was already unfolding, even though Anne herself remained unaware. And soon, the king would seal her fate with a single devastating rumor. If you're still with me, hit subscribe. It keeps these dark histories alive. Tell me, do you think Anne ever truly had a chance the moment she arrived in England? The first night of disaster, Anne of Cleves entered her new life with sincere intentions. But sincerity held no value in the Tudor court. What mattered was whether she pleased the king, and King Henry VIII had already positioned her on the edge of failure. After their disastrous first meeting, he could not shake the embarrassment he felt. His pride, swollen and fragile, twisted every interaction with Anne into further proof that she was unworthy of him. Worse, he shared his disappointment openly, planting seeds that would soon sprout into poisonous accusations. The court noticed immediately. Henry's mood darkened whenever Anne approached. His usual theatrics, once a source of amusement, became sources of dread. Instead of delighting in her presence, he scrutinized her posture, her expressions, even the way she breathed. Anne, unfamiliar with his expectations, grew tense. Her attempts at conversation felt stiff and cautious, and her smiles were polite but strained. To Henry, this was not respect, it was rejection, and he could not bear rejection from the very woman who was meant to restore his pride. But the true fracture formed on their wedding night. The entire kingdom waited for word of consummation. Foreign ambassadors, eager to assess the strength of the alliance, sent frantic letters asking whether the union had been sealed. Everything depended on that private moment. The political future of England, the stability of the Cleves alliance, even Anne's safety. Henry, however, returned from the bridal chamber with a look of confusion and something darker, disdain. He told his closest attendants that he found her body unattractive, her presence unappealing, and her behavior so awkward that he felt no desire for her. This was humiliating for Anne, but far more dangerous was Henry's next claim. He complained about what he described as an unpleasant odor, a detail he repeated often enough that it soon circulated throughout the court. No one dared challenge the king, so the rumor spread, shifting shape as it moved from whisper to whisper. Some claimed it was simply sweat from her long journey. Others insisted it was something far worse, something intimate, something that made Henry recoil. It did not matter whether the rumor was true. The moment Henry spoke it, it became a weapon. Anne, meanwhile, sensed the king's distance but did not understand the severity. She assumed that Henry's health, which everyone knew was declining, was the reason for his coldness. She had no idea that the king was telling courtiers he felt no man's desire for her. She continued her duties politely, completely unaware that her husband's disgust was now shaping her reputation. Every day, the tension thickened. Henry avoided her whenever possible. He returned to his council with new grievances, none of which had anything to do with Anne's character. He resented the political pressure that had forced the marriage. He loathed that she did not ignite the admiration he craved. And most of all, he hated being reminded of his age, his pain, and his diminishing control. Anne was not the cause of these insecurities, but she became the target of them. The courtiers adjusted their behavior accordingly. Those who had once praised Anne's modesty now described her as dull. Those who admired her composure now called her emotionless. Even small details, the cut of her dress, the texture of her hair, the sound of her accent, became exaggerated flaws in the eyes of those who sought to stay aligned with Henry's shifting moods. She was being socially dismantled one whisper at a time. Meanwhile, Henry obsessed over the failure of the marriage night. He discussed it relentlessly with his physicians, asking whether he had been bewitched or misled. His doctors, desperate to maintain favor, assured him that his reaction was natural, hinting that Anne's appearance and odor might indeed be unfortunate. They fed the king's narrative, not because they believed it, but because contradicting him was too dangerous. By the time Anne realized something was wrong, the narrative was already carved into stone. That whisper about her scent, unfair, cruel, perhaps entirely fabricated, had become the explanation for the king's refusal to touch her. It protected his pride and provided an excuse to dismantle the marriage without blaming himself. Anne of Cleves, who had crossed an ocean to fulfill her duty, now stood at the center of a royal humiliation she did not understand. And far worse was coming, because soon Henry would accuse her of something that would put her life and the fragile peace of England directly in jeopardy. A queen with nitrogen monoxide power to save herself, Anne of Cleves, had no idea that her marriage was collapsing around her. She continued to perform her duties with earnest obedience, unaware that each polite gesture, each reserved smile, was being interpreted as confirmation of Henry VIII's disappointment. The king rarely visited her chambers. When he did, the meetings were brief and awkward, Henry standing at a distance as though her very presence unsettled him. Anne could feel the coldness, but she assumed her husband's health or political burdens were to blame. She had no reason to imagine that the king was already searching for a way out. But the true danger emerged not from Henry's silence, but from his words. Behind closed doors, the king repeated the same complaints to his council. Anne was not pleasing. Anne did not excite him. Anne repelled him. Each time he spoke, the rumor sharpened. Her supposed odor, once whispered as mere awkward gossip, grew into a defining part of her reputation. Some claimed it was the reason he could not consummate the marriage. Others insisted it was a sign that she was unsuitable for intimacy. No one dared question the king's judgment, and so the lie became accepted truth. This rumor did more than embarrass Anne. It placed her in mortal danger. For Henry VIII did not simply abandon wives. He destroyed them when it suited him. The courtiers knew this too well. They remembered Anne Boleyn's execution. They remembered Catherine Howard's beheading. A king who felt humiliated was a king who sought retribution. And now Henry was telling his council that he had been deceived into this marriage, a word that echoed ominously through the halls of Whitehall. The council understood what the king wanted, a way to erase the marriage without admitting weakness. And so they began searching for a loophole. Some suggested that Anne's betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine years earlier might render her union invalid. Others hinted that her lack of English customs made her unfit for the king. All of these arguments were thin, but in Tudor England, legality bent easily when the king desired it. While the council schemed, Anne lived in a state of growing confusion. She noticed that the ladies at court avoided speaking freely around her. She noticed that servants seemed tense in her presence. Even her German attendants received fewer updates from the king's advisers. The court was turning inward, sealing its secrets away from the queen, whose future they were dismantling. Yet Anne remained gentle, optimistic even, believing that a misunderstanding could be resolved with patience. She could not imagine the depth of Henry's resentment. What stung Henry most was not Anne's appearance or scent. It was what she represented. She reminded him that his once commanding presence had weakened. His body had betrayed him. His attempts at romance had fallen flat. She symbolized a mirror he could not bear to look into. And so, in his mind, she became the cause of his humiliation rather than a victim of it. As weeks passed, the king avoided her entirely. Court festivities continued without her. Foreign ambassadors noticed her absence and sent alarmed reports home. They recorded Henry's bitterness, his complaints, and his increasingly dramatic insistence that he could not tolerate her as a wife. Some ambassadors even warned their courts that the marriage might soon be dissolved. These letters traveled faster than truth and returned to England with rumors that Henry felt deceived, that Anne had hidden something from him. Anne's political value began to crumble. The alliance with Cleves no longer benefited Henry, now that the threat from France and the Holy Roman Empire had diminished. Without the political necessity of the marriage, Anne was little more than an inconvenience, and worse, a reminder of the king's vulnerability. Her fate rested entirely in Henry's shifting moods, and his displeasure was becoming more theatrical with each passing day. One morning, Anne was informed that the king would not be visiting her again until further notice. No explanation, no courtesy. The message was formal, cold, and absolute. Anne's attendants sensed the gravity instantly. When Henry withdrew affection, he withdrew protection. And a queen without the king's protection walked dangerously close to the fate of Henry's past wives. The final blow arrived quietly, in the form of a question whispered by Henry's council. Had the marriage ever been valid at all? This question, seemingly legal, carried deadly implications. If the marriage was invalid, Anne would lose everything: her crown, her position, her safety. If it was deemed deceptive, she could be accused of fraud. And if Henry felt particularly wounded, she could face an even darker judgment. The council needed only one more justification, one more accusation, to destroy her marriage completely. And Henry was preparing to give it to them. The accusation that could end a Queen Anne of Cleves awoke one morning to an unsettling stillness in the palace. Her attendants whispered among themselves, bowing too quickly, avoiding her eyes. Something had shifted. She felt it in the way every corridor grew colder as she passed, the way servants bowed lower but spoke less. She sensed danger, but could not name it. What she did not yet know was that Henry VIII had delivered the final blow to her reputation. He had informed his council that something about Anne had repelled him so completely that he could never fulfill the duties of a husband. In Tudor England, where a queen's worth was tied to marriage and heirs, this accusation was devastating. Henry's complaint traveled through the court like smoke through a dry hall. Whispers magnified it, reshaped it, stretched it into something monstrous. Courtiers repeated it with hushed fascination, claiming the king had recoiled during their private time, insisting she emitted a disagreeable presence. The rumor grew grotesque in retelling, painted as the reason the marriage remained unconsummated. Some repeated it with pity, others with cruelty. But all agreed on one thing. The king was searching for a justification, and this rumor, born from wounded pride, gave him exactly what he needed. Anne, however, remained unaware of the details. She only knew that Henry had not visited her in weeks, and that the council no longer requested her presence. She waited patiently, believing she had simply done something wrong in manners or custom. She asked her attendants whether she should offer the king an apology, a gesture, anything that might ease the distance between them. But her attendants, fearful of speaking too freely, urged her only to remain calm. The council, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to build a legal case against the marriage. They gathered every scrap of evidence they could twist into grounds for annulment. They highlighted Anne's previous betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine years earlier. They questioned whether Anne truly understood the marriage contract. They even scrutinized her letters, searching for signs of misrepresentation. These arguments were flimsy, but when supported by the king's personal complaints, they hardened into what looked like legitimacy. Henry's frustration reached a breaking point. He confided to his trusted advisers that he had been misled about Anne's suitability. He exaggerated every detail: her clothing, her demeanor, her manner of speaking, turning mild cultural differences into reasons for royal outrage. To Henry, the problem was not Anne herself, but what she symbolized. She reminded him that he was no longer the charismatic king of his youth, capable of commanding desire simply by entering a room. His reaction to Anne felt like proof that age and illness were consuming him. Rather than confront these insecurities, he projected them onto the woman who had become the easiest target. The rumor regarding her personal scent, however distorted, served a darker political purpose. It allowed Henry to claim his body rejected her, thus absolving him of any failure. It framed the marriage as an impossibility before it had ever truly begun. This explanation, insulting as it was, became a shield for the king's pride and a blade pointed at Anne. Foreign ambassadors observed the unfolding disaster with alarm. Letters sent across Europe described a court in chaos, a king increasingly volatile, and a queen trapped in a political nightmare she did not comprehend. Some ambassadors quietly suggested that Anne's life might be in danger if the situation escalated. Others predicted that Henry would soon accuse her of deception or impurity, accusations that historically ended badly for queens. Yet, despite the growing storm, Anne continued to behave with dignity. She attended religious services. She socialized with the ladies of the court. She wrote polite letters to her brother, the Duke of Cleves, assuring him that the marriage was stable. She still believed that the king's distance was temporary, perhaps caused by illness or stately pressures. She did not know that Henry had already instructed his council to prepare the legal framework for dissolving the marriage. One evening, a group of council members arrived unexpectedly at her chambers. Their expressions were solemn, their tone overly formal. Anne welcomed them with confusion, offering them a seat, but they refused. Their message was brief. The king had concerns regarding the validity of their marriage, and she would soon be questioned. They offered no details, no comfort, no guidance. They left as quickly as they arrived, leaving Anne stunned, her hands trembling as she tried to understand what offense she could have committed. That night, Anne slept little. She replayed every interaction with the king, every gesture, every moment since her arrival. She wondered whether her manners had been wrong, whether she had spoken poorly, whether some unseen mistake had doomed her. She had no idea that the king's accusation, whispered, exaggerated, reshaped by gossip, was now being wielded as a political weapon against her. And by morning, the council would confront her directly. Their questions would determine not just her future as queen, but whether she would survive her marriage to the most dangerous husband in Europe. The interrogation of a Queen Anne of Cleves woke before sunrise, her heart still pounding from the council's unexpected visit. The castle seemed colder than usual, its corridors hollow and watchful. Servants offered her polite smiles, but avoided meeting her eyes. She sensed that something irreversible was coming, though she could not imagine the scale of the betrayal about to unfold. When the knock came at her door, it echoed like a verdict. The delegation entered her chambers with stiff formality. These were not friendly advisers, but the king's legal instruments, men trained to dismantle reputations with precision. They bowed, not out of respect, but out of ritual. Their faces were composed masks, revealing nothing of the king's true intentions. They began with gentle questions: her upbringing, her previous betrothal, her understanding of the marriage contract. Anne answered carefully, politely, unaware that every word was being twisted into potential evidence against her. She did not know that Henry VIII had already told the council that the marriage had not been consummated, and that he believed she bore responsibility. Then the tone shifted. The councilors pressed her about her physical state, asking questions that carried veiled accusations. They inquired whether she considered herself fit for marriage, whether she understood the expectations of a wife, whether her body had properly adapted to life in England. Anne, confused and embarrassed, tried to respond with dignity, but she sensed that their questions were not genuine. They were confirming a narrative that had already been decided. The king's rumor, the whispered insult that had clung to her name since their wedding night, had become the silent foundation of their interrogation. Anne felt the walls closing in. She asked whether the king was dissatisfied with her. The councilors exchanged stiff glances, but offered no explanation. Instead, they recited legal interpretations, discussing annulment as though it were a simple administrative correction. They suggested that if she confessed confusion about the marriage contract or acknowledged fear of consummation, the process could be resolved peacefully. Their voices held a softness that felt like a trap. Anne began shaking. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that her crown did not protect her. In this court, survival depended not on truth, but on the king's version of truth. She had seen the fate of Henry's previous wives. She knew that innocence had not saved them. Her life now hung on fragile diplomacy, not resistance, not pride. Her attendants watched helplessly from the corner. They could not intervene. They could not speak. They could only witness the slow dismantling of their queen. Later that day, the counselors returned with a second round of questioning. This time, they were more direct. They told her plainly that the king believed the marriage invalid. They informed her that Henry was considering a full dissolution on the grounds of non-consummation. They hinted, though never said outright, that the king had expressed profound aversion. The room grew silent at that word. Anne stared at them, her breath caught between disbelief and humiliation. But the counselors were not finished. They explained that if the king declared that he had been misled, the matter could escalate into charges of fraud, an accusation that historically carried deadly consequences. They stressed that by cooperating, she could protect not only herself, but her family back in Cleves. Refusal, they implied, would be dangerous. Anne's world collapsed in that moment. She understood that this was no longer a discussion. It was a warning. She asked them directly what the king wished of her. The counselors, relieved that she had finally reached the inevitable conclusion, answered with chilling simplicity. Henry wanted freedom. Freedom from the marriage. Freedom from embarrassment. Freedom to rewrite the past weeks as a mistake rather than a failure of his own pride. Anne felt tears burning behind her eyes, but forced them back. She knew crying would only be interpreted as weakness. She nodded quietly, telling them she needed time to reflect. The counselors bowed and left, confident that she understood her position. When the door closed behind them, Anne collapsed into a chair, not from shock, but from clarity. She finally understood that she had never been a queen in Henry's heart. She had been a political strategy, quickly discarded, and now a legal inconvenience being swept aside. Outside her window, bells rang softly across London. Life continued. Markets opened. Horses clattered down the streets. The world was indifferent to the slow erasure of a queen. Anne knew she had one decision left to make, one that would determine whether she survived the Tudor court or became its next tragedy. And Henry VIII was already preparing the final stage of her downfall. If you're ready for the darkest turn yet, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments. Would you have fought the annulment or chosen survival like Anne? The death of a marriage and the woman who outlived a King Anne of Cleves rose the next morning with a clarity forged not from confidence, but from survival. She understood the Tudor court, now in a way she had not before. This was not a palace of honor, but a maze of power, pride, and fear. And the man at its center, Henry VIII, was less a husband than an unpredictable force of nature. If she opposed him, she would be crushed. If she resisted the annulment, she risked the same fate as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. The memory of their deaths lingered in every shadow of Whitehall, in every whisper behind closed doors. Anne made her choice. She would live. When the council returned, expecting resistance, they found instead a woman who understood the stakes. Without tears, without anger, without pleading, Anne stated calmly that she wished only the king's happiness. She did not confess wrongdoing. She did not accept the ugly rumor that had spread through the court. But she did acknowledge that, if the king believed the marriage invalid, she would not stand in his way. The counselors exchanged glances of relief. She had saved them weeks of negotiation, and possibly a public scandal. They promised her generosity, titles, estates. They assured her of safety. Whether those promises would hold depended entirely on Henry's mood, but they needed her cooperation to protect the illusion of royal dignity. Henry, upon hearing Anne's willingness to accept the annulment, was triumphant. Not grateful, triumphant. In his mind, the failure of the marriage was now a bureaucratic misunderstanding, rather than the result of his own insecurities or cruelty. With a signature, he rewrote reality. The union had been invalid from the start, and because he declared it so, the world was expected to believe it. The annulment was announced with dignified language that masked the brutality beneath it. It cited political misunderstandings, her previous betrothal, and a lack of consummation. It did not mention the rumor that had ignited the king's disgust. It did not mention humiliation or wounded pride. But the court knew. Europe knew. Anne, despite her innocence, had been reduced to a grotesque anecdote in the king's private complaints. Yet what followed was remarkable. Instead of dismissing her coldly, Henry offered Anne a new title, the king's beloved sister. It was not affection, it was strategy. By granting her this symbolic role, he preserved the alliance with Cleves and presented himself as a merciful monarch. Anne accepted it, understanding that this identity offered something infinitely more valuable than a crown: safety. She moved to Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn's family. There, far from the venomous politics of court, she began to rebuild her life. Freed from the pressures of queenship, she adapted quickly to English customs. She dressed in the Tudor style. She learned the language. She found comfort in independence, something rare for a woman in her era, rarer still for a discarded queen. Henry visited her occasionally, always with a performative warmth that contrasted sharply with his cruelty during their marriage. He seemed to enjoy her company more now that she posed no threat to his pride or political ambitions. Anne received gifts, income, and homes. She rode horses, supervised her estates, and attended court events only when she wished to. For the first time since her arrival in England, she tasted peace. Meanwhile, Henry remarried, disastrously, and remarried again. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was executed for adultery. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, survived him. The king's health deteriorated rapidly. His leg ulcer worsened. His temper grew monstrous. His appetite returned with a vengeance. By the time he died, swollen and bitter, the court braced itself for yet another violent transition of power. But Anne of Cleves lived on. She outlived Henry. She outlived all of his other wives. She even outlived some of his children. The woman once mocked for her unpleasant presence became, quietly and elegantly, the most successful of Henry's queens, not because she won his heart, but because she understood, at the most critical moment, that her life depended on humility, strategy, and restraint. History remembers Henry VIII as the man who dismissed Anne with a single insult. But time revealed the deeper truth. The king who mocked her died, consumed by his own body, while the wife he humiliated found freedom, wealth, and longevity. In the end, the tragedy was never Anne herself. It was the court that weaponized a rumor, and the king who needed that rumor to hide from his own decline. Anne of Cleves survived a marriage designed to destroy her, and that survival was her quiet, triumphant revenge.